On the first Monday of March 2024, at 7:12 in the morning, the crux in Cloud County could be measured in 2 parked trucks and 1 set of assumptions. Hank Tucker stepped out of a 1996 Ford F-150 with rust climbing both fenders, a cracked bench seat patched with gray tape, and 312,000 miles on the odometer, while Trent Halverson leaned against a 2-year-old diesel pickup with dealer plates, polished wheels, and chrome, bright enough to mirror the grain elevator behind him. At the Concordia Co-op coffee counter, Hank watched people take in that image in one glance and settle on a story. Worn overalls meant broke. Press shirt meant successful. That was the first mistake. Hank wore the same faded cap he had worn since a hail season in 2011, gloves dark with grease at the fingertips, and a canvas jacket whose left sleeve had been mended twice. Trent wore a tailored vest with his brokerage logo stitched over the chest and a watch that caught every fluorescent light in the room. When Trent spoke, he spoke in clean, urgent numbers meant to sound modern. You are sitting on dead equity. Land is at $9,600 per acre in that corridor. You could roll that into 1,200 acres, finance operating at 7.25%, and scale while margins are still open. Hank stirred weak coffee, looked at the table, and said nothing for a long stretch. Then 4 words. Lines matter more than noise. People laughed softly, not cruelly, but with the confidence of a group sure it had him figured out. They had seen Hank buy bolts one at a time, wait for auction days, and patch his own hydraulic hoses behind the machine shed instead of calling mobile service at $165 per hour. They had not seen his ledger books, kept in pencil and then entered into a plain spreadsheet every January 1st. They had not seen that he had paid 0 interest since 1994. They had not seen 728 paid-for acres assembled in slow, unfashionable increments across Cloud and Reno counties. They saw drafty windows on his farmhouse and decided poverty. They did not see liquidity. Hank had not always known how to do this. In 1989, at age 23, he worked ground he did not own and slept in a room above a machine shop in Concordia for $140 a month, utilities included if he kept the furnace filters changed. His first full season came on a handshake lease for 160 acres at $42 per acre. Total rent, $6,720. Seed cost him $4,980. Fertilizer cost $8,430. Diesel and repairs ran $3,240. Insurance and small incidentals added $1,180. His total operating cost was $24,550 before labor, and his corn yield averaged 124 bushels per acre at a sale price near $2.06. Gross revenue came to $40,870. After rent and inputs, he cleared roughly $16,320 before taxes and living expenses. It was not glamorous. It was enough to stay in motion. The formative lesson did not arrive as a speech. It arrived as a bank statement in 1993. Hank financed a used combine for $48,000 at 9.20%, because everyone told him that was what serious operators did. The payment schedule looked manageable on paper until one wet harvest cut quality, basis widened, and repair invoices stacked in November. By January 1994, the note had cost him $4,416 in interest. He could count line by line. That number settled into him like a splinter. He sold feeder cattle, delayed a barn roof, and paid the balance down in one shot that spring. By the second week of April 1994, he wrote a rule on the inside cover of his ledger. "If I cannot pay cash, I cannot afford it yet." He never broke that rule again. He did not build alone. A neighbor named Lowell Kranz, older by 3 decades and nearly always quiet, leased Hank an extra 60 acres in 1991 at below-market rent after watching him return every borrowed tool cleaner than he received it. Lowell gave him one line that mattered. "Pay me when you can. Pay yourself first." Also in 1991, in a separate sale, Hank bought a small parcel, 80 acres of mixed dryland and creek-bottom ground, for $52,800 cash. The market expected bidding heat. Hank arrived in a frayed coat and wrote a cashier check for $52,800, exactly the amount he had set aside in a low-yield money account, earning 4.7%. No drama, no lender, no delay. That pattern repeated while louder operators chased speed. In 1998, he bought a used John Deere 4430 for $11,200 cash and put $1,860 into hoses, belts, and tires over 2 winters. In 2006, he bought 120 acres for $198,000 cash after carrying treasury notes and certificates of deposit long enough to avoid a rushed sale of grain. In 2010, when commodity prices teased everyone with expansion stories, he ran his own break-even math on a yellow legal pad. With prepaid inputs and no debt service, his corn break-even sat under $3.80. A financed expansion package from a local lender would have pushed that threshold above $5.20 before weather risk. Hank folded the pad, put it in his pocket, and went back to greasing the planter. His living costs stayed so plain that outsiders mistook discipline for deprivation. Annual property taxes on the home place were $3,420. Utilities averaged $2,980. Food averaged $6,460 because he raised beef, froze vegetables, and bought bulk staples twice a year. Truck insurance and fuel came to $2,740. Health insurance was $2,900. Clothing, mostly workwear and one church suit, was $540. Church giving and local dues were $1,200. Repairs on the farmhouse averaged $2,400. The annual total came to $22,640 in higher-cost years, and often below $20,000 when no major repairs hit. In 2023, he logged $18,640 exactly. He kept that number in the margin because he knew the arithmetic would eventually collide with a survey stake and a legal map. Early discipline for Hank never looked dramatic. It looked like refusing speed when speed was praised as vision. He ran a 1978 International Harvester 1486 that most dealerships would classify as retirement metal. In January 2024, the tractor needed a clutch pack, hydraulic seals, and a rebuilt injection pump. Total parts cost $2,400. His labor, 4 evenings and a Saturday. Comparable financed replacement quote from Selena, $198,000 at 8.10% over 7 years. Monthly payment $3,085. Total paid $259,140 before insurance and maintenance. Hank recorded both totals in his book, circled the difference, and closed the cover. He bought nitrogen early when seasonal dips appeared, prepaid chemical when distributors offered 2% cash discounts, and stored grain when basis punished harvest deliveries. On one 2022 corn block near Hutchinson, He held 31,400 bushels from October to February. Basis improved by 31 cents per bushel, adding $9,734 gross. Storage and shrink costs were $3,210. Net gain, $6,524 for waiting with working bins and no note pressure. Neighbors carrying variable lines often sold at harvest because interest meters were running every day. Hank could wait because no meter was running on him. Trent hated that logic because Trent earned on movement. He kept approaching Hank with glossy projections, each one built on borrowed growth. At a Reno County meeting in late February, Trent spread a packet across a folding table and tapped the page with one finger. You are underutilizing prime ground. This is not 1994. You either scale or get left behind. I can put you into a 1,200-acre structure with blended debt service inside year one cash flow. Hank looked at the page, looked at the door, and answered with 7 words. Cash flow is not the same thing. 3 days later, county staff marked a drainage line on old records tied to a fence that had sat in the wrong place since 1967. The first survey flags went in just south of Concordia. Hank watched from the edge of a field, hands in his coat pockets, while a young technician checked bearings twice and called out distances into the wind. Drivers at the road slowed, looked at the orange stakes, and kept moving. But by the time March ended, 12.04 acres would move on paper, and a county that had measured Hank by rust would have to measure him by math. One pickup stopped long enough for Trent Halverson to step out, smooth his vest, and wave a glossy folder over his head, as if he had arrived to settle the whole county before lunch. Hank Tucker stood 20 yards away in a jacket, with 2-stitched elbows, mud-dulled boots, and a cap sun-faded almost white at the brim, watching the survey crew pull another tape line across dormant grass. Trent's truck idled with the heated seats still on, dealer plate frame shining, and a digital dash that showed a monthly lease payment of $1,148 on the screen when he opened the door. Hank's Ford sat by the ditch with one headlight cloudy and a tailgate that no longer latched unless you lifted and slammed at the same time. The visual contrast did half of Trent's work for him. 2 men from the road crew looked once, then looked again at the folder, and decided which man had the plan. Trent spoke loudly enough for everyone on the right-of-way to hear. You can end this with one signature. We carve the corrected strip, sell at $9,600 per acre, put $115,584 to work, and leverage into 1,200 acres while the corridor is still moving. Hank took the folder, glanced at the first page, and handed it back without folding a corner. He asked only one question. What is the reset clause after year 2? Trent answered with polished speed. Variable line starting at 7.25%, market adjusted quarterly, interest-only option year 1. Hank looked toward the flagged fence line, then to the technician writing bearings in a wet notebook and said, That is not certainty. By noon, people in town had already reduced the exchange into gossip shorthand. Trent had offered growth. Hank had refused progress. The arithmetic in that rumor was wrong by a wide margin, but rumor always travels without a calculator. The survey chief, Dana Hales, called both men to the county pickup tailgate and spread the preliminary plat beneath a magnetic weight. Bearings tied back to a 1967 fence installation had drifted off the recorded legal by enough to matter, and the corrected polygon penciled in at 12.04 acres on Hank's side. Dana explained the chain of documentation, original deed language, section corners reset in 1982, drainage easement notes, and current geospatial confirmation. Hank listened with his hands in his pockets, then asked for certified copies, not summaries. Trent asked how fast the county could clear titles so market participants could proceed. Dana answered with procedural caution. Title review first, tax reassessment next, then filing window for quiet title, narrow and non-negotiable. Hank said, "I want an independent survey attorney." Dana gave him two names. Hank chose Ruth Ellison in Salina by 4:40 that afternoon, paid her $7,400 retainer by wire before supper, and requested full forensic review, including mineral language, drainage encumbrances, and historical tax maps. He did not argue at the ditch. He funded preparation. That reflex had roots older than most of the men critiquing him at coffee. In October 1987, when Hank was 21, he watched a neighbor named Vernon Pike stand silent at an auction ring while his machinery sold lot by lot to satisfy notes that had floated upward with interest. Vernon had borrowed $620,000 across land and operating lines when money was cheap, then saw rates climb and grain move the wrong direction in the same 2 seasons. Hank never forgot what the numbers looked like on the sale bill. 1979 tractor, sold for $18,500 against a remaining balance of $31,200. Combine, sold for $26,000 against $44,900 owed. Planter and tillage package, sold for $9,300 against $15,600. Deficits everywhere. Vernon was not reckless. He was squeezed. Hank carried that image into his first lease years, then made his one financed combine mistake in 1993 and felt the drag of 9.20% in his own account. From 1994 forward, he built policy from pain, not pride. Cash first. Prepay inputs, repair what works, hold grain when basis is punitive. Buy land only when a cashier check can clear the same day. Lowell Kranz reinforced that framework with the kind of guidance that never sounds dramatic in the moment and defines a life in hindsight. Lowell's rule was simple. Own one thing each decade that cannot be taken by a payment schedule. In 1991, that was the first 80 acres at $52,800 cash. In 2001, Hank added 96 acres from an estate sale for $124,800 cash, plus $6,900 in tile repair over 3 years. In 2006, he closed on 120 acres at $198,000 cash, then spent $14,260 leveling ruts and rebuilding waterways before the first full crop. In 2012, he declined a lender package that would have financed a 16-row planter, a late-model combine, and 2 center pivots for $1,140,000 at blended 5.60% because the schedule required $153,900 annual payments before a single weather surprise. He kept older equipment, bought used upgrades at auction instead, and spent $38,400 total over 5 years to achieve most of the same field capacity. By the first week of March 2024, his land stack sat at 728 owned acres with no liens and leased acreage flexed by season based on margin, not ego. If you want to know where this path starts for most people, it starts in the small decisions nobody applauds, the ones that look stingy until a hard cycle arrives. Subscribe and stay with this because the legal correction was only the spark. The ledger behind it was the engine. On Tuesday morning, while Ruth Ellison's office requested courthouse scans, Hank climbed into the machine shed and finished a repair that would never make gossip rounds. Steering valve seals on the 1978 International Harvester, 1486, parts already on the bench, torque specs clipped to cardboard, shop heater ticking in the corner. He had $2,400 in parts tied up in the winter overhaul and about 24 hours of his own labor across 6 evenings. Trent's preferred alternative, quoted in writing, remained a newer tractor at $198,000, financed over 84 months, total projected payout $259,140 before insurance rider increases. Hank's method tied up cash once. The finance method drained cash every month and punished any bad harvest timing. That same discipline showed in fuel contracts and fertilizer timing. For spring 2024, he prepaid 62% of nitrogen at 57 cents per unit in December when suppliers discounted for cash versus 71 cents spot by April. On 41,000 applied units, that spread saved $5,740. He did not call it strategy. He called it buying early. His household numbers told the same story with less romance than most people wanted, and more power than most people understood. He tracked spending down to categories that bored everyone except him. Home and outbuilding insurance, $2,180. Electricity and propane, $3,120 after weatherization. Food, $6,310 with bulk buys and freezer inventory. Truck fuel and insurance, $2,980. Health costs, $3,040. Clothing and work boots, $620. Property maintenance, $1,860. Giving and local dues, $1,200. Total, $21,310, and a high repair year, lower in calm years. He budgeted for replacement, not image. The Ford's transmission rebuild in 2021 cost $3,900 once and bought several more years, while neighbors cycled $700 to $1,200 monthly payments through perpetual upgrades. By Wednesday afternoon, when Trent's assistant called with a revised proposal, reducing origination fees to help the transition, Hank declined in 10 words. I do not finance urgency. Send legal descriptions only. Ruth Ellison's review began returning details by Thursday, and each one rewarded the same habit that made Hank look old-fashioned. Documentation kept longer than memory. The 12.04-acre correction held under title History, but the deeper file check also surfaced a mineral royalty clause attached to a predecessor deed that had never been asserted correctly after a family probate transfer years earlier. Average annual royalty attributable to Hank's corrected interest, once reconciled against 6 prior payments and decimal ownership fractions, came to $18,200 across the previous 6 years, with 1 year at $21,440 and one at $14,980, depending on production volume. That discovery did not produce celebration. It produced another checklist: file claim notices, correct tax basis, allocate revenue treatment between operating and non-operating accounts, preserve principal. Hank sat at his kitchen table under a yellow light, copied each instruction into his ledger, and penciled a line beneath the page total. Lines matter more than noise. By the end of that week, Cloud County still saw the same man climbing down from the same rusted Ford, coat cuff frayed, lunch in a reused container, gloves patched at the thumb. What changed was not his appearance. What changed was the quality of the paper now moving through county offices, attorney files, and assessor records. Trent still had polished language and a fast package, built on leverage and momentum. Hank had certified plats, paid retainer receipts, cost sheets, yield maps, and 35 years of decisions that had reduced risk every season instead of stacking it. The county had not witnessed a personality contest. It had witnessed a framework test, and the framework, with fewer moving parts, was beginning to win on the only standard that survives weather, markets, and opinion: verified arithmetic. Verified arithmetic looked less like a dramatic revelation and more like a long table covered in plain paper. Ruth Ellison sent over the first reconciled packet on Friday morning, and Hank Tucker sat at his kitchen table with a sharpened pencil, a calculator older than some of the co-op clerks, and 35 years of ledger lines that matched bank statements to the dollar. Trent Halverson had offered speed. Hank answered with sequence. He started where his own rules started, at the year he stopped paying lenders to sleep at night. The entries were spare, almost austere, but each one carried a choice that compounded into the next. 1989. Leased 160 acres at $42 per acre. Total rent, $6,720. End-of-year retained cash after tax, and living costs, $11,460. 1990. Added custom baling work. Gross side income, $7,840. Retained $5,910 into reserve. 1991. Bought first 80 acres for $52,800 cash. Paid closing costs of $1,460. Remaining liquidity, $8,300. 1993. Financed combine at 9.20%. Interest paid $4,416 in 1 year, marked as policy failure. 1994. Liquidated feeders and grain carry. Paid note off in full. Wrote zero interest rule in ledger. The pace did not look ambitious to anyone chasing acreage rankings at winter meetings, but it was internally coherent. In 1995, he bought the home quarter, 160 acres with a drafty house and marginal outbuildings, for $88,000 cash from accumulated reserves plus one estate equipment sale. In 1998, he bought the John Deere 4430 for $11,200 cash, then spent $1,860 over 2 years to make it feel reliable. In 2001, he bought 96 acres from an estate for $124,800 cash and set aside $2,300 annually for tile and drainage maintenance. In 2006, he bought 120 acres for $198,000 cash, then put $14,260 into land leveling and waterways instead of financing larger iron. In 2013, he acquired 72 acres of creek-adjacent ground for $172,800 cash at $2,400 per acre, when a family wanted a clean sale with no contingencies. In 2017, he closed on 200 acres for $640,000 cash. Acre total, 728. Liens, none. As Ruth continued building the file, she also itemized what Hank's discipline had done to his input structure, which was where the gap between appearance and reality widened into something almost unfair. Hank prepaid seed, nitrogen, and a majority of chemical in off-season windows whenever discounts exceeded carrying costs. Over the 5-year period from 2019 through 2023, his average annual prepay discount benefit came to $18,470. Storage strategy added another edge. He sold roughly 58% of corn post-harvest when basis improved, not because he could predict the top, but because no bank was billing him daily interest for waiting. Average annual basis gained net of storage and shrink over those 5 years, $27,360. Repair-first equipment policy reduced fixed costs further. His annual machinery depreciation and replacement reserve averaged $64 per owned acre. Comparable finance fleets in the same corridor, based on co-op benchmarking, ran between $181 and $236 per acre before unscheduled repair stress. Ruth turned those lines into a plain comparison Hank appreciated. If he had accepted the 2012 financing package, he declined, with blended 5.60% on $1,140,000, an annual debt service of $153,900, then repeated conventional replacement cycles, he would have paid an estimated $1,847,000 in principal and interest over 12 years and carried residual balances into a 13th season. Instead, his actual outlays for used equipment purchases, parts, and major rebuilds over that same period totaled $612,400. The difference was $1,234,600 in preserved cash flow, before considering lower insurance costs and lower tax friction from simpler balance sheets. That was not philosophy. That was subtraction. Hank added one more line that mattered more to him than net worth headlines. Household discipline was part of farm resilience, not separate from it. From 2014 through 2023, his average annual living cost was $19,420. Highest year, with major roof and well work, $22,640. Lowest year, $17,980. 10-year total living spend, $194,200. Neighbors with similar acreage but financed home upgrades, recurring vehicle notes, and layered consumer credit often ran between $48,000 and $76,000 annually in household outflow. That spread, even at modest returns parked in short treasuries and insured deposits, compounded. Ruth calculated that Hank's lower household burn had left an additional $356,000 available for opportunistic land purchases and operating reserve over the decade. The mineral clause correction widened the frame again. 6-year average attributable royalty, $18,200 annually, with documented year-to-year variance based on production. Retroactive claim treatment and forward correction, once filed, would increase non-crop cash inflow and reduce pressure to monetize land during the weak commodity years. Hank did not treat that as permission to expand. He treated it as another buffer against forced timing. When Ruth asked how he wanted the royalty allocated, operating or reserve, he answered in 7 words: half reserve, half taxes and waterwork. Let me stop here and ask you something. When rates rise and weather turns against you, do you want growth that needs perfect timing or margins that survive average mistakes? That question sat over Cloud and Reno counties more heavily than any slogan about modernization. Because across those same years, good operators who followed prevailing advice were getting cornered by the same math from the other side. Eli Pruitt had never been careless. He kept clean records, rotated responsibly, and made payroll on time when he still had crews. His decision to scale onto 480 rented acres came with a package that looked manageable at signing. $1,860,000 in variable debt tied to land and operating needs, initial rate 4.10%, lender projections built on stable input costs and corn over $5. Then the rate reset cycle bit. At 8.70%, Eli's annual interest alone rose by $85,560. Rent did not wait. Inputs did not wait. Repairs did not wait. He sold grain into bad basis twice to keep current, refinanced once, then watched options collapse when another reset notice arrived. At auction, he stood beside his wife and two grown sons and thanked buyers for coming. He lost the farm, but nobody who understood the numbers called him foolish. He was leveraged into a rate regime that did not care how hard he worked. Marlene Ortiz was equally disciplined in her own way, and she had built a reputation for clean cutting and reliable timing on wheat runs from Southern Cloud into McPherson corridors. Her mistake was not laziness. It was believing one expensive machine could be safely absorbed because everyone said custom demand would cover it. The combine was $410,000 at 6.40%, with quarterly payments of $57,300 after bundled service terms and insurance requirements. Wheat then slid under $5.20 while diesel and parts climbed. She cut her own draw. She sold a trailer. She still could not keep the payment cycle intact after 2 weak quarters and delayed receivables from clients under stress themselves. The lender restructured once, then repossessed. Marlene did not disappear. She restarted with older leased equipment and rebuilt route by route, but the finance jump cost her 5 years. Wade Jensen's path was harsher because livestock compounds every input shock. He borrowed $2,300,000 for hog barns with confidence in forward margins and feed assumptions that held for exactly 1 season. Then feed and propane costs doubled over the next cycles, and veterinary and labor costs climbed in parallel. Variable debt repriced upward. Cash burn became relentless. His brother, Colby Jensen, had guaranteed part of the note to help secure terms, not expecting the guarantee to become real. When Wade's operation failed, Colby surrendered his inherited 160 acres to satisfy claims. They were not reckless men. They were brothers trying to keep a family foothold in a system that punished leverage when volatility clustered. None of these people mocked Hank later. They were too tired for that, and too honest. They saw what he had protected when he looked like he was refusing progress. He had protected optionality. Then the weather made the contrast unavoidable. Reno County entered a second consecutive moisture deficit year, with cumulative rainfall well below long-term normals through planting windows. Subsoil moisture maps showed depletion where root depth had carried previous seasons. Corn stands came up uneven in lighter sections, and dryland stress appeared early on south-facing rises. At the same time, operating lines across the region repriced again. Some borrowers who had started seasons near 7% saw effective rates closer to 8.5% once fees and utilization terms were included. Input invoices arrived before yield certainty, exactly when lenders grew stricter on advance percentages. Hank's break-even sheet for his corn blocks, updated with current prepaid input costs and zero debt service, sat at $3.72 per bushel. That number included seed, fertilizer, chemical, fuel, crop insurance, property taxes allocated per acre, machinery reserve, and a conservative labor charge. Comparable local operations carrying new equipment notes, higher cash rent, and variable interest were running break-evens between $5.11 and $5.89, depending on structure. At $4.60 corn, Hank still generated contribution margin. At $4.60, several neighbors were underwater before family living costs. Soon, the first formal distress calls reached co-op logistics. One operator requested deferred drying charges. Another asked for split invoicing to push payment dates past expected crop insurance timing. Eli, now out of active ownership and working toward stability, was the one helping route rail allocations and quietly telling younger growers which conversations to have early with suppliers. Marlene, rebuilding with discipline earned the hard way, started taking shorter radius custom jobs with cash on completion terms to avoid receivable strain. Wade took diesel technician shifts in Salina and came home after dark, determined to clear the last personal obligations without another refinance. Colby worked with an attorney to structure a lease-to-own pathway if any track came back within reach. Their stories began to bend, but the pressure remained real. County policy shifts added another layer. Updated drainage compliance deadlines required documented improvements for certain low areas, and inflation had pushed tile and earthwork bids up by 19% versus 2 years prior. For leveraged operators, that was another unfunded mandate. For Hank, it was a line item. He approved $46,700 in targeted drainage and water retention work on vulnerable blocks, paid on completion, and booked the expense against reserves. He also prepaid a portion of diesel for harvest to cap volatility exposure. None of this made him invincible. A failed crop still hurts when weather turns, but he could absorb bad luck without surrendering control to a lender calendar. Trent Halverson kept pressing urgency even as the environment punished urgency. He circulated revised packets arguing that scale was now more necessary because margins were thin, which for Hank read like recommending more sail in higher wind with a torn mast. At a crowded board meeting, Trent framed the boundary correction as a fleeting monetization window and warned that idle equity would decay in real terms if not leveraged. Hank responded by placing one stapled document set on the table. Corrected plat references, title attorney summary, decade-spanning cost ratios, and a one-page ledger sequence ending with 2024, projected net worth crossing $6,430,000 at zero debt. He did not lecture. He let the pages speak. The room changed without fanfare. People who had dismissed him as a stubborn relic leaned forward and read line items in silence. No applause, no dramatic conversion, just a different quality of attention, the kind given to numbers that hold under pressure. And as drought maps darkened and rate notices continued to arrive, the county began to understand that Hank had not been rejecting growth at all. He had been selecting the only form of growth that could survive weather, policy, and human error, then still leave enough strength to help someone else when the cycle turned. The turn came in public, with fluorescent lights humming over folding chairs at the Cloud County hearing room and dust still on Hank Tucker's boots from checking emergence that morning. Trent Halverson presented first, smooth and fast, with a bundled development bid built on parcel assumptions that had looked reasonable before the corrected plat entered the record. He spoke about velocity, corridor demand, and financed resale margins, then cited projected gains as though the line had already been settled in his favor. Hank sat in the second row in his worn jacket, yellow legal pad on one knee, and waited until the clerk called his name. Ruth Ellison stood beside him with 3 binders and 1 certified survey packet from Dana Hales. Hank handed over the corrected legal description, the quiet title filing proof, and the reassessed tax worksheet without commentary. Then he did something that changed the room's posture in under a minute. He wrote a cashier check for $23,418, full adjusted back taxes and fees, and passed it to the treasurer before anyone could ask for a payment plan. No lender letter, no contingency note. Paid in full, on the spot. One board member looked toward Trent, then back at Hank, as if checking whether he had missed a step in the sequence. The treasurer read the receipt total aloud for the record, and the clerk stamped it at 2:43 in the afternoon. 2 seats behind Hank, an appraiser from Salina whispered, "He just cleared it in cash." The whisper moved faster than Trent's packet ever had. Ruth followed with the mineral reconciliation notice and corrected royalty allocation schedule, including 6-year averaging at $18,200 annual attributable income and revised tax treatment. Dana confirmed bearings and section corner ties one more time under oath. The record closed around verified paper, not persuasion. Trent requested a recess to review new mapping implications and took 6 minutes in the hallway before returning with a shorter voice and narrower options. When the room emptied, the adjacent 54-acre tract that had been floated in Trent's bundle moved from speculation to a direct sale conversation under the corrected boundary assumptions. Hank's offer was simple: $8,950 per acre, total $483,300, 10-day close, no financing clause, no appraisal contingency, no delayed possession disputes. The sellers accepted by sunset because certainty had become more valuable than top-line ask. Closing occurred in Concordia, with one wire from Hank's reserve account and a recorded deed before lunch. Trent's downstream buyers lost underwriting that same afternoon when their bank withdrew after plat corrections invalidated projected lot geometry. At the next county meeting, Trent's only public statement was restrained and exact. We proceeded on incomplete mapping. Nobody laughed, nobody gloated. The arithmetic had already delivered the verdict. If you are learning something from this, press like and share it with someone who still believes debt is the only way to grow, because this county just watched a different framework hold under pressure. The stronger reveal came in the co-op boardroom when Hank agreed, reluctantly, to let the finance committee review his numbers for a risk management workshop. He placed one printed net worth statement on the table, signed and tied to deeds, statements, inventory, and reserve accounts. Total assets after the 54-acre close and tax adjustments, $7,096,840. Total liabilities, $0. Net worth, $7,096,840. The figure included land valued conservatively at blended local comparables, grain inventory marked at current bid-less handling, equipment at realistic auction values, cash and treasuries, and the corrected mineral stream capitalized at a cautious multiple rather than optimistic projections. The room did not react with applause. It reacted with stillness, the kind that appears when private assumptions collapse in real time. Eli Pruitt read the statement twice, then set it down gently and nodded once. Marlene Ortiz stared at the equipment line and asked Hank what depreciation schedule he used on the 1486, because she recognized the discipline hidden in that one small number. Wade Jensen leaned back, exhaled, and said nothing for almost a minute before asking the only question that mattered to him. How much cash do you keep liquid when rates move? Hank answered in 9 words. 12 months inputs plus 1 bad harvest. Colby Jensen wrote that sentence in his notebook and underlined it 3 times. Trent was not in that room. Hank could have stopped there with vindication and privacy. Instead, he moved to impact, with the same plain structure he used for land purchases. He met with Ruth Ellison, the Concordia Co-op treasurer, and a community banker from outside his operating footprint to avoid conflicts. They drafted the Tucker-grounded Futures Fund at $1,200,000 initial capitalization, ring-fenced from farm operations, with the written criteria and annual reporting requirements. No ribbon cutting, no banquet, Just filed documents and a one-page mission statement. Reduce rate-risk casualties among disciplined producers. Allocation 1 was $300,000 for zero-interest equipment notes to beginning farmers. 4 recipients, maximum $75,000 each, 7-year repayment, first-year payments deferred until after first harvest, collateral limited to purchased equipment rather than family land. Recipient 1, Jenna Laird, age 27, leased 140 acres and needed a planter and grain cart upgrade. She received $75,000, bought used equipment for $62,400, reserved $12,600 for repairs and parts, and lowered per-acre planting cost by $34 in her first season. Recipient 2, Thomas Bell, age 31, needed a dependable tractor after repeated rental delays. He took $68,000, purchased a used unit at $54,500, invested $9,300 in tires and hydraulics, and held $4,200 as a repair cushion. Recipient 3, Leah Kim, received $75,000, split between a used sprayer and no-till drill, reducing custom application dependency on 220 acres. Recipient 4, Daniel Reese, took $61,000 for hay and forage equipment that stabilized winter feed costs for his cow-calf operation. The remaining $21,000 in that pool stayed uncommitted until the next cycle. Allocation 2 was $450,000 for down payment match grants, capped at $75,000 each, structured as one-to-one matches requiring documented savings, and a 5-year owner-operator covenant. 6 growers qualified in year 1. Colby Jensen was one of them. He brought $52,000 in savings rebuilt from wages and lease profits, received a $52,000 match, and paired it with seller financing on an 80-acre lease block that included an option pathway toward buying back 40 acres tied to his former family ground. Another recipient, Amina Ortiz, no relation to Marlene, matched $75,000 and closed on 46 acres of irrigated mixed ground near a family support network, which reduced hired transport and seasonal labor costs. Each grant agreement included one clause Hank insisted on. If land was sold inside 5 years without hardship exemption, the grant converted to a repayable note to keep speculation out. Allocation 3 was $180,000 for drought-resilient water infrastructure grants. This money did not pay for expansion, it paid for survival capacity. Eli Pruitt, now managing grain logistics, chaired the review panel to keep the process practical. 8 projects were funded: variable rate irrigation retrofits, 2 tailwater recovery pits, 1 shared moisture monitoring station network, and targeted field drainage corrections where standing water loss had been chronic. Average grant size was $22,500. Measured outcomes in the first full operating cycle showed reduced pumping costs, better infiltration on problem acres, and lower emergency hauling during heat periods. The numbers were not glamorous, but they moved break-evens in the right direction. Allocation 4 was $270,000 reserved for emergency operating seed loans at zero interest, short duration, released only after private lenders declined or offered terms likely to trigger distress. Wade Jensen qualified under this category while rebuilding his household and side operation after moving into diesel work. He drew $38,000 for seed and fertilizer on leased acres with a 12-month repayment plan tied to crop insurance timing. He repaid in 11 months and borrowed nothing the following season. Another borrower, Rachel Boone, used $44,000 to bridge spring inputs when her line was cut 30%. She repaid after harvest and maintained her lease position, instead of surrendering acres at the worst point in the cycle. At the quarterly update session, the fund had committed $1,037,000 and kept $163,000 in reserve for late-season shocks. The committee published summaries at the Co-op Board and County Extension Office: amounts, recipients, repayment status, and outcome metrics. Hank attended the update in his same faded cap, sat in the back, and left before questions turned into praise. He did not want myth. He wanted replication. The deeper examination, the part most people skip because it is less cinematic than a courtroom, was the ledger proof that this generosity was not a one-time gesture, but the product of repeatable arithmetic. Hank and Ruth released a 20-year comparative sheet built from his actual records and regional benchmarks. From 2004 through 2024, cumulative interest paid by Hank on farm debt, $0. Cumulative interest avoided versus a modeled moderate leverage path using prevailing rates and typical renewal cycles, $1,486,300. Cumulative machinery, cash outlay and rebuilds, $1,042,700. Modeled financed machinery pathway with comparable field capacity, $2,611,900, including interest and required insurance riders. Difference preserved, $1,569,200. Land acquisition sequence showed the same compounding discipline. 1991, 80 acres, $52,800 cash. 1995, 160 acres, $88,000 cash. 2001, 96 acres, $124,800 cash. 2006, 120 acres, $198,000 cash. 2013, 72 acres, $172,800 cash. 2017, 200 acres, $640,000 cash. 2024, 54 acres, $483,300 cash. Total owned after correction and purchase, 794.04 acres. Weighted average cost basis across owned land after improvements and closing costs, approximately $2,216 per acre. Comparable irrigated and mixed valuations in 2024 for those corridors, conservatively blended, roughly $8,900 to $9,900 per acre, depending on water and access. Equity gap created by time, patience, and no forced sales. Several $1 million before mineral income. Household burn rate reinforced resilience. Hank's 10-year average personal and home spending remained under $20,000, compared with modeled peer averages above $54,000 when recurring consumer debt and newer vehicle cycles were included. Difference over 10 years, before modest yield on retained cash, around $340,000. Add conservative short-term Treasury returns on retained liquidity, and the practical advantage widened further. That cash became timing power when sellers wanted certainty and when neighbors needed bridge support without punitive terms. Recipient trajectories were tracked with the same rigor during the annual review presented in that same boardroom. The 4 equipment note recipients improved average operating margin by an estimated $41 per acre across combined acreage, lowered breakdown-driven delays, and stayed current on zero-interest schedules. Down payment match recipients collectively controlled 318 acres they likely would have kept leasing at rising rates. Ownership converted volatility into equity. Water grant recipients reported measurable yield stabilization in stress blocks and lower per-acre pumping expenses. Emergency seed loan users avoided distressed asset sales in the cycle's worst quarter. Multiply those outcomes across families and suppliers, and the local impact exceeded the initial dollar figure. One disciplined balance sheet had become a risk buffer for an entire corridor. During a break between agenda items, word moved quietly through the hallway that Trent Halverson had closed his Reno County office and accepted an appraisal role in Wichita. He told two former clients, quietly and without performance, that he now recommended lower leverage structures when rate risk was unclear. It was not public penance. It was behavioral correction. Dana Hales stayed with the county survey office and used the Tucker file as a training case for junior technicians on why historical fences are evidence, not authority. Ruth Ellison kept her retainer paid and her documentation immaculate, then sent Hank a one-line note after the final filing. Precision scales. And Hank kept farming. Same truck, same rust. Still the 1996 Ford F-150 that most people misread before they read a single ledger page. Same patched gloves. Same habit of writing numbers before sunrise. The county still saw him at the coffee counter, quiet as ever. But now, when someone talked about growth, they asked a different first question. Not how fast, how fragile. That was the real reveal. Not that Hank was wealthy, though he was. It was that liquidity, built without noise, could survive a hard decade and still finance somebody else's second start. The hallway conversation did not turn into celebration, and Hank preferred it that way. He stood by the bulletin board outside the co-op room while Eli Pruitt and Marlene Ortiz compared seed delivery windows for the first emergency loan cycle, and Hank asked only for one rule in writing. Repayment schedules had to match harvest cash reality, not calendar neatness. By the second week of October 2024, the first outcome sheets were already showing that the fund was changing behavior before it changed balance sheets. Jenna Laird finished her fall run on 140 leased acres, with planting and application timing she had never been able to control before. The used planter and grain cart package she built from the $75,000 note lowered custom hire costs by $4,760 in one season and cut replant losses by 3.4 acres that had previously missed moisture windows. Her gross revenue came in at $186,900, operating costs at $141,200, and she closed the year with $45,700 before taxes and family draw, enough to make the first scheduled principal payment and keep $12,000 in reserve. She paid $9,600 back to the fund on schedule and prepaid $2,400 toward the next installment. Tomas Bell's $68,000 equipment note looked smaller on paper and mattered just as much in practice. Rental delays had cost him field days in 2 prior seasons. With his own tractor and repaired hydraulics, he planted within target windows across 182 acres and avoided a late planting yield penalty that he estimated at 11 bushels per acre on corn blocks. At $4.84 per bushel average sale price, net of basis and handling, that timing alone preserved roughly $9,700 in gross revenue. He ended with $31,400 in retained earnings after expenses, repaid $8,500 of principal, and carried no high-interest parts debt into winter. Leah Kim's $75,000 package, split between a used sprayer and no-till drill, reduced her dependence on custom scheduling when weather windows narrowed. She farmed 220 acres, trimmed per-acre chemical application cost by $18, and improved stand consistency enough to lift soybean yield by 4.2 bushels per acre on her heavier ground. Her first-year net improvement over prior baseline after maintenance and fuel was $23,980. She paid the note exactly as written and added one clause to her own books. 12 months of input coverage before any expansion. Hank never told her to do that. The arithmetic did. Daniel Reese took $61,000 for hay and forage equipment, then used the savings from lower outside feed purchases to stabilize his cow-calf operation through winter. He reduced purchased hay expense by $27,300, increased carryover inventory, and avoided a short-term operating line that had been quoted at 8.40% variable. His repayment arrived 2 weeks early. The number was not huge. The pattern was. By New Year 2025, the equipment note pool had 4 active borrowers, 0 delinquencies, and cumulative principal returned of $36,700. That returned money was not idle. It revolved into a 5th note for a beginning grower in Republic County tied to Cloud County logistics, extending the same terms with the same collateral rule: equipment only, never family land. The down payment match group moved more slowly and more deeply. Colby Jensen's matched $52,000, paired with seller terms on the 80-acre lease block and the option track toward buying back 40 acres, kept him in production while he rebuilt ownership one legal page at a time. He hit every benchmark in his covenant year: required savings deposit, soil maintenance compliance, and operating margin reporting. 12 months in, he had reduced outstanding seller balance by $18,400 above minimum terms. Amina Ortiz's full $75,000 match on 46 irrigated acres did what lease volatility never could. It converted annual rent uncertainty into fixed equity accumulation. Her annual payment schedule was not light, but it was predictable, and predictable is survivable. She reduced transport and hired labor outflow by $14,200 through location efficiency alone. After year 1, she held $27,600 cash reserve and no consumer debt. 4 other recipients in that match class added 192 acres of owner-operated stability to the corridor. Combined, the 6 matched buyers controlled 318 acres with a conservative market value, near $3,020,000, and cumulative owner equity at year-end of $842,000, including down payments and principal reduction. Without the match structure, most would have remained on short leases with rising rates and no balance sheet growth. The multiplier was visible. $1 granted had generated $3.46 in stabilized local ownership value within the first cycle. The water infrastructure grants produced quieter wins, the type only farm ledgers appreciate. 8 projects, $180,000 total, reduced pumping and runoff losses, enough to lower average break-even by an estimated 17 cents per bushel across participating corn acres. 2 tailwater recovery installations cut peak season diesel usage by measurable margins. Shared moisture monitoring reduced over-application events. Eli chaired those reviews without sentiment and without leniency because he had lived what happens when thin margins meet bad assumptions. The panel rejected 3 proposals that were really expansion plans in disguise. It approved practical resilience work instead. Emergency seed loans, the hardest category to administer, ended the year with 5 borrowers, $201,000 deployed and $163,000 still reserved for shocks. Wade Jensen's $38,000 loan closed in 11 months as projected. Rachel Boone's $44,000 bridge loan kept her from surrendering leased acres in a panic sale. She repaid after harvest and entered the next season with supplier terms reset on stronger footing. Another borrower, a young operator from near Miltonvale, used $29,000 to avoid a predatory short-term note and remained current through drought stress. By March 2025, repayment performance sat at 100% on matured emergency notes. This was not luck. Terms were built around reality. The cascading effect spread through people who were not direct borrowers. Local parts suppliers reported fewer last-minute charge account crises. The co-op's grain desk saw reduced distressed selling at the first week bid. Families that had been one poor quarter away from asset liquidation began carrying small reserves. In 2 counties where urgency had been sold as sophistication, patience was quietly regaining status. Trent Halverson watched this from outside the role he once held. He closed his Reno County brokerage office after the boundary correction unwound the pipeline that depended on aggressive parcel assumptions and financed flips. He took an appraisal position in Wichita at a salaried rate reported by one former colleague at roughly $118,000, with performance bands, less upside than brokerage years, but steadier and less exposed to cycle swings. What mattered was not his income line. What mattered was his language shift. At first, people expected him either to deny everything or to disappear. He did neither. During winter valuation meetings, he began flagging rate sensitivity in plain terms and recommending lower leverage when repayment depended on top quartile yields and strong basis at the same time. He told one producer in Reno County, "If this only works in perfect years, it does not work." That sentence sounded like something he would have dismissed 12 months earlier. He did not become Hank. He did not need to. He became more careful, and careful saves people quietly. By late spring 2025, Trent had also started sending 2 kinds of clients away from high-risk packages: first-generation operators without reserve buffers and families trying to recover from prior restructures. He referred several to cooperative or family seller paths with smaller tracks and fewer contingencies. There was no public apology event, no forced redemption arc. There was a practical correction in professional behavior and in a county economy that counts. 3 days after planning wrapped in Cloud County, Dana Hales filed the final training memo from the Tucker survey case for junior staff. Verify monuments, verify deed language, verify tax history, then speak. Ruth Ellison, paid in full from day one, kept 1 copy of every filed correction in a labeled archive and sent Hank her shortest invoice note yet. All items reconciled, no outstanding actions. Hank put that note in a folder, not on a wall. The roll call at the co-op annual meeting that June read like a ledger of second chances. Eli Pruitt still managed grain logistics in Concordia, with rebuilt household savings at $96,000 and no variable farm debt hanging over him. Marlene Ortiz expanded her custom harvest route to just over 22,000 acres by running older, paid-for equipment with disciplined maintenance windows and cash reserves for breakdowns. Wade Jensen remained in diesel work, debt-free, taking selective seasonal acres he could fund without borrowing. Colby Jensen farmed his leased 80 with the 40-acre buyback option, moving from hope to timetable. Jenna Laird, Thomas Bell, Leah Kim, Daniel Reese, Amina Ortiz, Rachel Boone, and the newer emergency borrowers were all current, all operating, all reporting numbers that improved because terms were built for weather and rates rather than optimism. Lowell Kranz had passed years earlier, but his line still surfaced when younger growers compared notes after meetings. Own one thing each decade that cannot be taken by a payment schedule. Vernon Pike lived quietly outside town, retired, attending church suppers when weather allowed. Hank visited twice each winter, and never mentioned old auction days unless Vernon brought them up first. The men who had once looked finished were now part of the county's cautionary memory and its practical wisdom, not its gossip. And Hank Tucker stayed visually unchanged enough to confuse newcomers. The 1996 Ford still carried rust on the fenders and the same stubborn tailgate. The 1978 International Harvester, 1486, still started after glow time and routine checks, its overhaul costs logged line by line. Household spending remained under $20,000. Inputs were still prepaid when discounts beat carrying costs. Land remained paid for. After updated valuations and fund commitments, his documented net worth sat near $7,100,000 with no debt. He kept no office sign and gave no speeches longer than a minute. If you want more stories where arithmetic beats noise, subscribe now because this pattern repeats wherever discipline outlasts fashion. If this story made you reconsider one financial habit, comment with the exact rule you would write on the inside cover of your own ledger. Share this with one person who looks successful on paper but feels trapped by payments, and one person who feels behind because they are choosing patience over image. At dusk, after the meeting dispersed and the parking lot emptied to 2 trucks instead of 20, Hank drove south out of Concordia with the window cracked, dust lifting behind the old Ford in a narrow ribbon. He turned past the corrected fence line, now marked to the legal inch, and idled by a field where young corn had taken evenly after a cautious spring. No headline marked that moment. No audience waited for a lesson. A man in worn overalls checked rows he could afford to keep, on land he owned clear, in a county where several families now had another season, because one farmer refused to confuse debt with progress. The poorest-looking farmer had been the most liquid. The liquidity became a bridge, and the bridge held. He eased the Ford past the corrected fence corner, set the parking brake, and sat with the engine ticking down while the last light thinned over the rows. In the glove box, beside a roll of electrical tape and 2 socket extensions, lay the folded copy of the certified plat Dana Hales had stamped in March. Hank took it out, checked the bearings one more time, and slid it back into a plastic sleeve marked Boundary Final. He did the same with Ruth Ellison's All Items Reconciled note and the county tax receipt for $23,418, each paper flattened and dated in pencil. Nothing ceremonial, just closure. The mineral claim letters had already posted, the corrected decimal interest had been accepted by the operator, and the first 2025 royalty deposit of $19,040 had arrived that afternoon, split exactly as he had instructed, half into reserve, half into taxes and waterwork. Lines on paper, money in the right buckets, noise finished. 4 days later, in the co-op conference room with the scorched coffee pot and the warped corkboard, the first full-cycle recipient review moved from promise to proof. Jenna Laird set her workbook down and read her own numbers without embellishment. Gross, $204,300. Total operating outflow, $149,870. Net before taxes and family draw, $54,430. Principal repaid to the fund by that date, $21,000. Repair reserve, $18,200. She looked at Hank only once, a quick glance as if checking permission to keep going, then added that she had declined a dealer promotion, carrying 8.05%, because the payment schedule assumed top quartile yields. "I can grow slower," she said. Hank nodded once. Thomas Bell followed with planted acre timing logs and fuel slips. He showed that avoiding rental delays had preserved 1,940 bushels he likely would have lost to late emergence. At a weighted average net of $4.71 per bushel, That was $9,137 kept on farm. He repaid another $10,000 principal that morning. By the first Monday of September 2025, Leah Kim and Daniel Reese brought the kind of pages lenders usually never see from smaller operators. Side-by-side comparisons with baseline years and weather annotations. Leah's no-till drill had reduced passes enough to trim diesel by 612 gallons over one cycle and cut compaction on her heavier blocks. Her soybean yield held steady in a dry spell where neighboring comparables dropped, and she credited timing more than luck. She had paid $18,750 on schedule and set a new rule in her binder: no expansion until 2 years of input cash sat in reserve. Daniel showed winter feed inventories measured by stack count and tonnage. The hayline had stabilized his calf weights and reduced emergency purchased feed by $31,880 year over year. He paid his second principal installment early and asked the panel to reduce his next draw limit, saying he no longer needed it. Eli Pruitt, chairing with a straight face that softened only when he looked down at a clean repayment line, approved it in under a minute. The multiplier effect arrived in the ledger before anyone gave it a name. At that same meeting, Amina Ortiz and 5 down payment match recipients presented Year 2 equity statements. Combined owner equity had moved from $842,000 to $1,196,400 through principal reduction and measured land value gains, while lease volatility on those acres dropped to 0 because they controlled title or contract terms. Water infrastructure projects reported average pumping cost reductions of 13.8% and documented break-even improvement near 21 cents per bushel on participating corn blocks. Emergency seed loans had matured at full repayment across 8 closed notes, with 0 interest charged and 0 forced equipment sales. The fund began with $1,200,000 and had circulated commitments whose direct on-farm effect now touched 1,940 acres across Cloud, Reno, and neighboring corridors. Eli wrote the aggregate on the board in thick marker. Stabilized production value, approximately $11,480,000 at current conservative land and output assumptions. One disciplined structure had become regional shock absorption. Trent Halverson's resolution happened without a podium. On a windy Tuesday in November 2025, at an appraisal standards workshop in Wichita, he stood in a room of 32 and used a redacted case study every local operator recognized anyway. He walked through a failed leveraged parcel strategy, the underwriting withdrawal after corrected mapping, and the consequences of building projections on assumptions that had not been legally confirmed. His old urgency was gone. "I treated speed as competence," he said. "I was wrong on that." After the session, he stepped into the hallway with Colby Jensen, who had come for valuation training tied to his buyback option. Trent handed him a 2-page sensitivity template with rate bands from 5.00 to 10.00% and said, "Run your downside first." Colby answered, "I do now." Trent no longer drove the leased pickup with the $1,148 monthly payment displayed on the dash. He drove a used half-ton with 126,000 miles and appraisal gear in the back seat. In 2026, his Reno office remained closed, his Wichita role remained salaried, and his recommendations documented lower leverage on first-generation files. No humiliation scene. Clear behavioral change. 3 days after Christmas 2025, a freezing rain tapped the co-op windows while the roll call that mattered happened around a long table with wet boots lined by the door. Dana Hales reported the Tucker boundary file was now part of county onboarding for new survey staff, including the lesson every trainee had to repeat: fences can guide, deeds decide. Ruth Ellison confirmed every legal instrument tied to the correction, mineral clause, and fund governance was closed, indexed, and backed up in both courthouse record and private archive. Eli Pruitt, still at Concordia Logistics, read his household account total into the minutes when asked for transparency. $128,400 saved, no variable farm debt, retirement account restarted. Marlene Ortiz reported 24,300 custom harvest acres, booked with 2 paid-for combines, 1 purchased in cash for $172,000 after 2 seasons of reserve building. Wade Jensen reported 0 personal debt and a selective 60-acre lease funded entirely from wages and retained earnings. Colby Jensen reported he had exercised the first option step and secured contract rights to buy back 40 acres over 6 years at fixed terms, with $26,000 already paid against principal. On the second week of April 2026, Hank hosted a small field day stop by request. No banner and no sponsorship. Just 10 folding chairs near the machine shed, and the 1978 International Harvester 1486 idling steady at low throttle. He opened the hood, pointed to the rebuilt injection pump, and read from his maintenance card. Overhaul parts. $2,400 in 2024. Additional seals and labor supplies $610 in 2025. Current hours logged, still field ready. Next to that card sat his yellow legal pad from 2010, the one with break-even math that had kept him out of financed expansion. He had boxed it for years. Now he passed it around and asked each younger grower to write 1 personal threshold line in the margin. Jenna wrote, "Keep 12 months of inputs." Tomas wrote, "Never borrow on hope pricing." Leah wrote, "Cash cushion first, acreage second." Daniel wrote, "Equipment only as collateral." Amina wrote, "Equity before image." Hank wrote nothing. He had already written his line in 1994. By harvest 2027, every named thread had an outcome and a place. The plastic sleeve in Hank's glove box still held the stamped plat, now creased at the same corner from repeated checks. The corrected mineral stream continued, averaging just above $18,000 annually with variance logged and taxes reserved immediately. The Tucker Grounded Futures Fund had completed independent audit each year, with public summaries posted at the Extension Office. Lowell Kranz remained gone, but his phrase lived in the margins of other people's notebooks. Vernon Pike passed away peacefully that autumn at 81. At the funeral dinner, Eli and Wade told younger farmers Vernon had been a good man trapped by bad timing, and they said it with respect. Trent remained in appraisal, quieter and more rigorous. Dana kept teaching bearings before opinions. Ruth kept files clean enough to survive any review. Hank Tucker kept farming paid-for ground across Cloud and Reno counties, driving the same rusted 1996 Ford with the stubborn tailgate, spending under $20,000 a year at home, and choosing repairs over display whenever arithmetic favored patience. His documented net worth moved with land and grain cycles. Sometimes up, sometimes down, but his liabilities stayed at 0 and his optionality stayed intact. At sundown one evening after first frost, he parked by the corrected line and stepped out into air sharp enough to sting his throat. He looked